Welcome to our story out of the past. Today I'm going to visit with George Champine. George, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Good morning, Lenny.
And George is going to tell us a little bit about growing up in Fairmont in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So, to begin with, George, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you live now, where you're from, and so on.
Well, I was born and raised in Fairmont and graduated from high school here. Went up to the University of Minnesota. We were very fortunate. We had a very high-quality school system here in Fairmont, and most of the graduates did go on to the college level. So at the university, I got a bachelor's and master's in physics, went on and got a PhD in information systems, computers, and then I worked in the computer industry for 45 years.
Well, going back to when you were growing up, what was it like? Let's start in the 1930s.
Okay, well, growing up in Fairmont in the 1930s was wonderful for kids, but that time frame was very difficult for adults.
Depression era?
It was the Depression. Kids, of course, didn't understand that, but we had wonderful parks, Sylvania, Ward's Park, Interlaken. We had the Japanese gardens in Interlaken. We had the amusement park out there, the zoo, and the whole town was a safe enclave. So kids had the run of the town, and they could go anywhere without the parents worrying about what was going on.
So their activities might have involved like Interlaken Park?
Well, swimming was the big thing,
Swimming.
with 5 lakes here in town, of course. And I think most of the kids spent all summer in the water. I know I did. And but the local organizations were very strong. Boy Scouts was very strong. Churches were very strong. The town, of course. And the center of activities revolved around the town, the school, and the churches.
What were the major economic drivers in Fairmont at that time? I realize it was Depression era, but what were the major employers and so on?
The Fairmont economy, of course, is a farm economy, and that was a big help during the Depression because we were less affected than the other towns or the other cities were. And also, we had the railroad motors and the Fairmont Canning Company, which were great. Those of us who went on to college, most of us could not have done that without the Fairmont Canning Company. I know I earned all the money required for college because after the Depression, my family had no money.
Well, going to that time period, what about the 1940s?
Well, the 1940s, of course, was dominated by the war. All the able-bodied young men went off to the war, and those of us who were left behind had to keep things rolling. There was rationing. Food was rationed, gasoline was rationed. You had to have the ration stamps in order to buy food, meat, sugar, gasoline. I think the quota for gasoline was 1 or 2 gallons a week. So I think people would be hard-pressed today to get by on 1 or 2 gallons a week.
What was the price of gas per gallon at that time?
It was probably around 10 cents, something like that, if you could find it.
A little different than today.
Yeah. You had to have the ration stamps in order to buy any gas.
What about the activities? What did kids do in Fairmont during the 40s?
Well, the Boy Scouts, as I mentioned, were very strong. D. Millay was very strong, Job's Daughters. The social organizations were quite strong then as they are now. One of the dominant things in the 40s, unfortunately, was the periodic epidemics of polio.
What was the mood of Fairmont at that time? You know, how did people feel about the economy, the future, just everything in general, politics? You know?
Well, the war was a time of great uncertainty. We had air raid training, air raid tests, and we all had to turn off our lights. All the lights in the town were turned off, and we had local air raid wardens that would go around and make sure all the lights were off. Great uncertainty. The Japanese invaded the Aleutians briefly, and nobody knew if we were going to win or lose the war. Fortunately, we did win it, and then the good thing was after the war there was quite a wave of prosperity and full employment. There was a building boom here in Fairmont, and my dad was an electrician, and I helped him wire a lot of the houses here in town.
And that carried on into the 1950s?
Indeed it did, yes.
Okay.
And
Well, what about the 1950s? What do you recall about Fairmont, growing up in Fairmont and Martin County during that time
Yes,
period?
well,
How did it change?
the 50s were probably the era of greatest prosperity and greatest social unity, not only in the country but in Fairmont as well. On a Saturday night in the 50s, downtown would be so crowded you could not walk on the sidewalk.
Really?
Theaters were very popular. The Strand Theater, as we called it, then later the Lake and the Nicholas Theater.
Okay.
And they were great fun.
What were some of the major retail stores downtown?
Well, we
During
had a
that
lot
time
of them. There were 8 or 10 men's clothing stores, a lot of women's clothing stores, several hardware stores, drug stores, etc. And so great prosperity, full employment. People made a lot of money. There was a lot of inflation. I remember going to Burton's Cafe, and I was astonished one time when the price of a hamburger went from 10 cents to 15 cents. I couldn't believe it. Prior to that, I was able to eat lunch downtown for a quarter. Hamburgers were a nickel and a chocolate shake was a dime. So it was a wonderful time and place to grow up. We were very fortunate. Like I said, it was completely safe. We had enormous freedom. We could run all over town. The families were very close-knit back in those days. Everybody went home for lunch. The school children walked home for lunch from schools.
Sure.
All the businessmen went home for lunch. So families ate together 3 meals a day.
Really a different time.
Yeah, very different. A great unity.
Right. Well, George, thank you very much. Appreciate it. This is Lenny Tweeden for Our Story Out of the Past. Until next time.